Hey guys, Miss Arnold here. Sorry I can't be with you today, but we're going to go over chapter 4, and you guys are going to take your notes kind of as we go. If it goes too fast, just pause it, fill in your notes, and then replay it so you can hear what it's talking about. Lots of instructions today. All your assignments will be on Google Classroom. First, you do your bell ringer like always. Then, you've listened to this lecture, fill in your notes, work on your exit slip. Then you will move on to the Unit 2 study guide. I don't know that you'll get finished with that at all, but if you do, you have some flashcards to look at on Quizlet. Everything goes in order on Google Classroom. Just scroll down as you get done with each assignment. So today, we're going to talk about the last section of Chapter 8, which is World War I. This will be talking about peace without victory. So, the Allies were determined the terms for the peace in the post-World War. There's a lot of give and take with these terms. Not every leader got exactly what they wanted in the peace treaty. So we're going to talk about what that was today and who had to give up and who had to compromise and who really suffered because of the treaty. So, first we'll start talking about the 14th points. This is Wilson's plan for just and lasting peace. So, on the top here, this heading here, the 14 points of your slide, I want you on your notes to put Wilson's plan for peace so that you know that. And you can go ahead and highlight the first bullet. Alright, his plan had many ideas to it, which included open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, removal of trade barriers, and the reduction of military arms for many countries. Alright, he wanted a fair system to resolve the disputes over colonies, and something that is called self-determination, which is the right of people to decide their own political status. Okay, it allowed those countries to form their own nations. Lastly, the 14 points wanted to establish a League of Nations. One of the things Wilson is probably most remembered for. So I want you to highlight the League of Nations there in that fourth dash. This was an organization of countries working together to settle disputes, protect democracy, and prevent future wars. Again, the people participating in World War I believed that this was going to be the war to end all wars. And so they wanted things in place that prevented conflicts like this in the future. The 14 points expressed a new philosophy that applied progressivism to the U.S. foreign policy. Alright, now the interesting thing that we'll talk about with the 14 points and the League of Nations being established is that the U.S. proposed the idea of the League of Nations, but we never joined the League of Nations. And we'll talk about why as we go through this lecture. Alright, so Wilson is going to lead the American negotiators attending the peace conference in Paris of 1919. He was the first U.S. president to visit Europe while in office, as of then, when attending the Paris Peace Conference. Of course, some criticized him for leaving because we were trying to restore our post-war economy. But Wilson had a big dream of international peace, so he wanted to see that through at the peace conference. It began on January 12, 1919, and you had leaders representing 32 nations there. The leaders of the Allied countries, Wilson in the U.S., British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and also George Clemenceau, the French Premier. Also an Italian Prime Minister. All of these countries together made up the Big Four. So I want you to highlight that fourth bullet. Okay, so you know who the Big Four are. The countries that were not invited to the Paris Peace Conference are going to be the Central Powers. Who are the Central Powers? Very good. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Alright, now like I said, not everyone, all Big Four powers there did not get what they wanted at the peace conference. They had to compromise. They had to, it was a little give and take for them. And they all arrived with competing needs and desires. So Wilson had this vision of a better world. Like we said, he wanted to ensure international peace. He wanted nations to deal with each other openly and trade with each other fairly. That's why in his 14 points, you see things that, encourage nations to be fair and also to open trade. He wanted other countries to reduce their arsenal of weapons, okay, again, found in the 14 points. But Wilson, not that he was alone in wanting a better world, but other countries were there wanting revenge, which was something that Wilson wasn't necessarily interested in. Many allies wanted to push Germany for its role in the war, to punish Germany. And some of the things in the Treaty of Paris are going to be put in place to do that, to punish Germany. All right. So the fact that World War I caused a huge loss of life, a whole generation of young men in Europe were taken out with this war. The French government wanted to put those lives on Germany. They wanted to blame Germany for that and for the continued suffering of the veterans. Again, if this is going too fast, go ahead and pause it. But we only have 15 minutes to get through the lecture. So, conflicting needs at the peace conference also included independence of different countries. You had leaders of Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia that wanted to build their own new nation. Poland, which was divided between Germany and Russia, wanted one nation. And Vietnam wanted to be freed. All right? So far you've got, at the peace conference, countries wanting a better world, wanting revenge, wanting independence. And the end is going to come with the Treaty of Versailles. They reached an agreement, presented the Treaty of Versailles to Germany in May, and the treaty was way harsher than Wilson wanted. Okay, again, like I said, those other countries were there. They were wanting revenge, and they wanted Germany to pay for the conflict it had started. So, the Treaty of Versailles required Germany to disarm its military forces, pay $33 billion in reparations. Okay, and I want you to highlight that bullet there that talks about reparations, because you'll need to know that for your quiz. This was payments for damages and expenses caused by the war. Now, $33 billion is a lot now, and it was a whole lot back then. This is not something Germany could afford. Okay, because we told you one of the reasons that Germany stopped fighting in World War I was because they just really lost the will to fight, because their country was in shambles. Their economy was, struggling. They had food shortages and things like that, so this is not something they could afford. And the Treaty of Versailles called for Germany to take sole responsibility for starting the war. The Central Powers also had to turn over their colonies to the Allies. And the treaty included some of Wilson's 14 points. It did create a League of Nations, and it did possess self-determination for some ethnic groups, but it did not get everything Wilson wanted to include. So, of course, Germany is going to strongly protest the treaty, but they signed it after France threatened military action. Alright, Wilson returned to the U.S. to present the treaty to the Senate. He needed support of both the Republicans and the Democrats to ratify it, but he had trouble getting the Republicans to support it. So he sees the Republican Congress divide into 3 groups. So I want you to highlight 1, 2, and 3, because this tells you what 3 groups those are and what they thought of the treaty. So Democrats supported immediate ratification of the treaty. Irreconsolables who wanted to outright reject the U.S. participation in the League of Nations, so they didn't want the U.S. to join at all. And then you had your reservationists led by Henry Cabot Lodge. And he said, and people like him, would only ratify a revised treaty. So, they didn't like all of it. They wanted changes to it. And reservationists thought the League of Nations charter requiring members to use force for the League conflicted with Congress' constitutional right to declare war. So if you have this League of Nations where you have all these groups, all these countries joining as a group, well, if they can use force against conflict, then that takes away the power of Congress to say, we have the right to declare war. So he wanted that power to stay with Congress. Now, with the division there in Congress, Wilson knew the treaty was probably not going to be ratified, so he refused to compromise, and he starts a tour of America, encouraging American people to pressure their senators into ratifying the treaty. All right, so he tours all kinds of places, 8,000 miles in 22 days. He gives 32 major speeches in those 32 days, and that's going to be quite a bit of work on him. The heavy touring schedule weakened him, and shortly after his tour, he suffered a stroke. Okay, when he did that, he really became just a negative, kind of cut off loner president. He cut himself off from his friends and his allies, and he really did not work well with others after that. He was not going to compromise on his ideas. You had Senator Lodge presenting a treaty to the U.S., including a list of 14 reservations or concerns about the Treaty of Versailles, but Wilson was just very unwilling to compromise. All right, and he rejected Lodge's treaty. After he left office in 1921, the U.S. Signed separate treaties with the Central Powers, Austria-Hungary and Germany, but never joined the League of Nations. Without U.S. participation in this league, the League didn't really have the ability to keep world peace. So the goal of the League of Nations wasn't reached because the country that proposed it did not join. All right, now we're going to go over very briefly here the impacts of World War I. So I want you to highlight the first bullet here. One of the major political impacts was that the war led to the overthrow of monarchies in Russia, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Turkey. And we talked about a few of those. For example, Russia, we talked about the Bolsheviks taking over and Lenin leading that group. Where it says that in the second bullet there, rise of Bolsheviks to power in Russia. It also fanned the flames of revolt against colonialism in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Your economic impact, we already talked about Germany and Austria-Hungary and how their economies are struggling. The U.S. is now the economic lead in the entire world. Okay, but we are still facing problems such as inflation, and a lot of people, couldn't afford ordinary items. Farmers who were prospering during the war are now, their goods are in less demand. So they are going to take a very hard hit at the end of that decade. And coming into the 1920s, farmers are going to be living in very large percentages of poverty. The social impact of World War I, it killed 14 million people, left 7 million men disabled. Like I said earlier, it took out a whole young generation of men in Europe. It drew more than 1 million women into the U.S. workforce, like we've talked about before. That helped women pass the 19th Amendment, and we know that is women gaining the right to vote. And it also encouraged African Americans to move to northern cities. Okay, the last thing here we'll talk about is just a sum up of the war in Europe. European nations lost almost an entire generation of young men. France, where most of the fighting took place, was in ruins. Great Britain was deeply in debt to the U.S. because we know they were getting $75 million worth of war goods a week during the war from the U.S. And the reparations forced Germany, to pay. They crippled the economy even more so than it already was. And as we know, World War I will not be the war to end all wars. Many issues were left unresolved. Okay, too much anger coming from the Treaty of Versailles, the end of the war, and just hostility among the nations. Within a generation, conflict would again break out, and we'll see that with World War II when we start our next chapter. So, if you missed anything, just rewind the video. Make sure you get all your notes in, because that will help you on the exit slip. After this, go back to Google Classroom and complete the exit slip. Alright, follow your assignments on Google Classroom. And I'll see you guys tomorrow.